In 1917, the Russian Empire, a colossal power that had stood for 300 years, just vanished. An entire social and political order, ruled by the all-powerful Tsars of the Romanov dynasty, imploded in a matter of months, reshaping the world in its wake. But this wasn't some sudden collapse. It was the explosive result of centuries of simmering resentment, staggering inequality, and the unimaginable horrors of a world war. This wasn't just a rebellion, it was a series of seismic shocks that tore a nation apart and birthed something entirely new and radical: the Soviet Union. So, how did one of the most powerful monarchies in history fall so spectacularly? What forces were unleashed in that fateful year? And who were the people steering the storm, leading to a communist superpower that would define the 20th century? Let's break down the causes, events, figures, and world-changing consequences of the Russian Revolution. First, let's set the scene. Picture Russia at the dawn of the 20th century. It's a land of breathtaking contradictions. While the royal family and aristocrats live in gilded palaces, the vast majority of the population are peasants. Many of them had been serfs, legally bound to the land until 1861. But even after being freed, they were crushed by debt and trapped in near-medieval poverty. In the growing cities, a new industrial working class was toiling in squalid factories for pitiful wages. Discontent wasn't just in the air, it was the low hum beneath the entire surface of society. This wasn't a gap between rich and poor, it was a chasm separating two different worlds, and that chasm was about to erupt. To really get why Russia exploded in 1917, we have to look past World War I. The roots of this revolution were deep and had been rotting the Tsarist regime for generations, fueled by a toxic cocktail of social, economic, and political problems. Let's start with the social structure. Russia was basically a feudal society trying to limp its way into the modern age. When Tsar Alexander II freed the serfs in 1861, it sounded great on paper. But in reality, the peasants had to make redemption payments for the land they received, locking them into decades of crippling debt. They were technically free, but many felt like they had just traded one kind of bondage for another. They wanted real ownership of the land they worked, and their resentment just kept growing. At the same time, Russia was going through a forced march of industrialization. Factories shot up in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, creating a new urban working class, the proletariat. This growth, however, came at a horrific human cost. Workers were crammed into unsanitary housing, worked grueling 12-hour days, and had zero legal protections. This new class was concentrated, angry, and literate enough to read revolutionary pamphlets. They were a powder keg waiting for a spark. And then there was the political failure at the very top. Russia was an autocracy, meaning the Tsar had absolute power. The man in charge was Tsar Nicholas II. By all accounts, he was a devoted family man who was tragically unfit to rule. He was indecisive, hated the idea of reform, and truly believed he had a divine right to rule. Any attempt to limit his power wasn't just a political disagreement. To him, it was a sin against God's will. This rigid mindset made him completely incapable of fixing the country's deep-seated problems. This rot was put on full display for the world to see during the 1905 revolution. After a humiliating defeat in a war against Japan, a peaceful crowd marched to the Tsar's winter palace to ask for better conditions. They weren't met by the Tsar, they were met by his troops, who opened fire on unarmed men, women, and children. This was Bloody Sunday, and it shattered the myth of the Tsar as the caring little father of his people. In its wake, strikes and uprisings swept the empire. To save his throne, Nicholas reluctantly created an elected parliament, the Duma. But the Duma was an empty promise. Nicholas II just dissolved it whenever it challenged him, making it obvious he had no real intention of sharing power. This proved to revolutionaries that change wasn't going to come through reform. It would have to be taken by force. And of course, there was Rasputin. While the Tsar was busy on the front lines of World War I, his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, fell under the spell of a charismatic and corrupt mystic named Grigory Rasputin. She believed he was the only one who could heal their hemophiliac son, Alexei. This gave Rasputin insane influence over state affairs. Ministers were hired and fired on his whims, while rumors of corruption and scandal swirled around the royal court, destroying whatever credibility it had left. To many, Rasputin was the living symbol of the decay at the heart of the Romanov dynasty. If Tsarist Russia was a rotten building, World War I was the earthquake that brought it all crashing down. Going to war in 1914 was the regime's fatal mistake. Russia simply wasn't ready for a modern war. Its factories couldn't produce enough rifles or supplies. Its transportation network was a disaster, leading to massive logistical breakdowns. While food rotted on railway sidings, soldiers on the front lines were sometimes sent into battle without guns, told to just pick up the rifles of their fallen comrades. The human cost was staggering, with millions of casualties in the first 2 years alone. The army was mostly made up of peasant conscripts who had no idea why they were fighting and even less commitment to the cause. Morale hit rock bottom. Then, in a move of pure catastrophic arrogance, Nicholas II decided to take personal command of the army in 1915. This was disastrous for 2 reasons. First, it directly tied the Tsar to every military defeat, making him personally responsible for the slaughter. Second, it left the government back in the capital in the hands of the deeply unpopular Tsarina and her advisor Rasputin, creating a power vacuum filled with chaos and corruption. Back home, the war caused a complete economic collapse. The government printed money to pay for the war, leading to runaway inflation. Food prices skyrocketed. Meanwhile, taking millions of farmers off the land crippled agriculture. This, combined with the failing railways, led to severe food shortages in the cities. Long lines for bread became a daily symbol of desperation and rage. The war didn't create Russia's problems, but it magnified them to a breaking point. By the winter of 1916, Petrograd was a tinderbox. War fatigue, political scandal, and hunger had created an explosive atmosphere. The final spark came on February 23, 1917, International Women's Day. What started as a protest by women textile workers demanding bread and peace quickly swelled into a massive citywide strike. Hundreds of thousands of workers poured into the streets. The Tsar, away at military headquarters, ordered the protests crushed by force. At first, some troops obeyed, but then came the decisive moment. On February 27th, soldiers from the Petrograd garrison, who were workers and peasants themselves, began to mutiny. They refused to fire on the crowds, shot their own officers, and joined the revolution. Once the government lost control of the military in its own capital, its authority just evaporated. Advised by his generals that he had no support, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne on March 2, 1917. Just like that, 300 years of Romanov rule came to an unceremonious end. In the aftermath, a strange and unstable situation known as dual power emerged. On one hand, you had the provisional government, formed by former members of the Duma and led by liberals and aristocrats. On the other hand, you had the Soviets, democratic councils of workers and soldiers who had actually driven the revolution. The powerful Petrograd Soviet controlled the army, the railways, and communications. So while the provisional government had the official title, the Soviet had the real power. It was an impossible situation, with 2 bodies pulling the country in opposite directions. The provisional government was doomed from the start. It was an unelected body of elites who had little connection to the workers and peasants who had just overthrown the Tsar. And it made a series of critical mistakes. Its single most disastrous decision was to keep Russia in World War I. The government felt it had to honor its commitments to its allies, Britain and France. But for the people, the main point of the revolution was to end the war. By continuing the slaughter, the provisional government immediately lost the support of the public. It also failed to deliver on the other key demands: land for the peasants and a fix for the food shortages. Into this power vacuum stepped one of the most pivotal figures of the 20th century, Vladimir Lenin. As leader of the radical Bolsheviks, Lenin had been in exile, but in April 1917, the German government, in a brilliant strategic move, put him on a sealed train back to Russia, hoping he would cause enough chaos to knock Russia out of the war. When he arrived, Lenin electrified the political scene with his April theses. He offered a radical, uncompromising alternative. His slogan was simple, powerful, and resonated with millions: peace, bread, and land. Peace meant an immediate end to the war. Bread meant an end to food shortages. Land meant giving estates to the peasants. He also called for all power to the Soviets, arguing that the provisional government was illegitimate and had to be overthrown. The Bolsheviks were still a minority, and their first attempt to seize power in the July days failed. But the provisional government's next blunder played right into their hands. In August, the Army's commander, General Kornilov, attempted a military coup to crush the Soviets. Panicked, the head of the government, Alexander Kerensky, had to turn to the Bolsheviks for help. He armed their militia, the Red Guards, to defend the city. The coup collapsed as railway workers sabotaged the troops, and Bolshevik agitators convinced the soldiers to stand down. The Kornilov affair was a disaster for Kerensky. It exposed how weak his government really was. For the Bolsheviks, it was a massive propaganda victory. They now looked like the true saviors of the revolution, the only group strong enough to stop a military dictatorship. Their popularity soared, and by September, they had won majorities in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. Lenin knew the time was right to strike. By the fall of 1917, the provisional government was a government in name only. It had no real authority. Lenin, sensing this weakness, urged his party to prepare for an armed insurrection. The takeover, brilliantly organized by Lenin's right-hand man, Leon Trotsky, was swift and nearly bloodless. On the night of October 24th, Bolshevik Red Guards methodically seized strategic points across Petrograd, railway stations, post offices, and key bridges. There was surprisingly little resistance. The final act was the taking of the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was meeting. This wasn't the heroic battle Soviet propaganda later made it out to be. It was a relatively small-scale affair. The ministers were arrested, and Kerensky managed to escape the city. While the takeover in Petrograd was quick, there was more significant and violent fighting in Moscow and other parts of the country. The next day, Lenin announced to the Congress of Soviets that power was now in their hands. He immediately proposed two decrees: the Decree on Peace, calling for an immediate withdrawal from the war, and the Decree on Land, which legitimized the peasant seizures of land. With these two masterstrokes, Lenin secured the support of Russia's soldiers and peasants. The Bolsheviks, a small party of revolutionaries, had just seized control of the largest country on earth. This revolution wasn't just about mass movements. It was also shaped by the genius and fatal flaws of a few key individuals. Vladimir Lenin, the architect. A ruthless and brilliant revolutionary, Lenin was the mastermind who adapted Marxist theory to Russia's reality. His political genius was his ability to translate the desires of the masses into simple, powerful slogans. Leon Trotsky, the organizer. Initially Lenin's rival, Trotsky became the brilliant strategist behind the October takeover. He would go on to create and lead the Red Army to victory in the civil war that followed. Joseph Stalin, the quiet operator. During the revolution, Stalin wasn't a frontman like Lenin or Trotsky, but he was a loyal and effective Bolshevik. His ruthless climb to absolute power would come later, after Lenin's death. Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor. A tragically inept ruler whose commitment to absolute monarchy made revolution all but inevitable. His failures as a leader paved the way for the end of his own dynasty. He and his family were executed by the Bolsheviks in 1918. Alexander Kerensky, the man in the middle. As the final leader of the provisional government, Kerensky tried to walk an impossible line between the old order and the radical left. His decision to stay in the war and his mishandling of the Kornilov affair sealed his fate. Grigory Rasputin, the symbol of decay. A mystic whose corrupting influence over the royal family made the monarchy a public joke. His presence at the heart of power was proof to many that the entire regime was morally bankrupt. The Bolshevik seizure of power wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of an even more violent chapter. The consequences would be immediate, brutal, and reshape the world. First, the revolution marked the end of the Russian Empire and the 300-year Romanov dynasty. In its place rose the world's first communist state. The Bolsheviks, who soon renamed themselves the Communist Party, began nationalizing industry and banks. In March 1918, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, pulling Russia out of World War I, though it cost them huge territories. But the Bolsheviks' hold on power was fragile. Their coup sparked a horrific conflict, the Russian Civil War. From 1918 to 1922, the Bolshevik Red Army fought the White Army, a loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, and foreign powers like Britain, France, and the U.S., who all feared the spread of communism. The Civil War was a period of unbelievable brutality. It saw massacres, pogroms, and the Red Terror, a campaign of mass executions by the Bolshevik secret police, the Cheka, aimed at crushing all opposition. By the time the Red Army finally won in 1922, an estimated 7 to 12 million people were dead, most of them civilians. The war devastated the country, but cemented Bolshevik power, leading to the official creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, in December 1922. The global impact was immense. The revolution inspired communist movements across the world and created a new ideological divide that would define global politics for the next 70 years, setting the stage for the Cold War. But this was only the beginning. The death of Lenin, the rise of Joseph Stalin, the terror of the gulags, and the Soviet Union's march toward global dominance, all of it began here in the fires of 1917. If you found this journey through the fall of the Russian Empire fascinating, make sure to subscribe to Ancient Vault. We uncover the revolutions, betrayals, and blood-soaked turning points that shaped human history. Because in Ancient Vault, the past isn't just remembered, it's resurrected. The Russian Revolution wasn't a single event, but a long, chaotic, and brutal process. It was the result of a deeply unequal society, a hopelessly incompetent government, and the unbearable strain of a catastrophic war. It began with desperate cries for bread and peace, and ended with the rise of a one-party state that would control the lives of millions. The revolution's promise of peace, bread, and land was a powerful dream for people who had known nothing but suffering. But the reality that followed, civil war, famine, and repression, was a nightmare. The fall of the Tsars didn't just change Russia. It created a new global superpower and a new political ideology that would force the world to take sides, shaping the 20th century in ways we are still grappling with today.